The scripture lesson today is taken from the 10th chapter of Luke, the parable of the Good Samaritan. Just then, a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" He said to him, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" He answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "You have given the right answer. Do this, and you will live." But wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers, who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, 'Take care of him, and when I come back, I will repay you whatever more you spend.' Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers?" He said, "The one who showed him mercy." Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." This is the witness of God's people. Thanks be to God.
It is very, very nice to be back home here with my faith family. I'm here to preach about a few of the things that I think about the most these days, about housing and about climate change, and oddly enough, about the theology of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. So who here watched Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, maybe as a child yourself or with your own children? Pretty good. You might remember folksy Fred Rogers stepping onto a simple public television set, putting on his cardigan, and welcoming you into a world of feelings and of friendship and of make-believe, singing gently, as we heard more beautifully than I can sing it. It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? If you're familiar with Mr. Rogers, maybe you know that he was in fact trained as a Presbyterian minister. He was the most influential theologian of my childhood. No offense to all of my actual ministers during my childhood, I guess. And he embedded in a generation of people like me a lesson that is one of the central teachings of our Christian tradition: to love your neighbor. So I've been thinking and reading a lot about Mr. Rogers lately, in part because he's back in the zeitgeist. There was a great documentary about him that came out last year, and a biopic starring Tom Hanks that came out just this week. I've also been thinking about him because, as many of you know, I've spent the last year shifting from being a religious leader to being part of governing a city, making real decisions that shape who is welcome here. And I am all of the time working to translate religious and spiritual values into on-the-ground decisions. And along the way, I've sought out wisdom and advice in every likely and unlikely place. And the theology of Mr. Rogers is one of them. So here's what I can tell you. Mr. Rogers believed in the spiritual and religious importance of little things and of friendships across difference. He was a unique television star with a real spiritual life, emphasizing the values of patience and of compassion and of silence in a noisy world. Rabbi and author Dana Ruttenberg describes the entirety of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood as profound theology, which she summarizes by saying, cultivate empathy, be curious, it's okay to have hard feelings, and most of all, love your neighbor as yourself. All of it, Ruttenberg says, a theological stance about who we are and who God is. So I grew up not far from here on the unceded territories we call Vancouver, in a pretty idyllic neighborhood, a Mr. Rogers type of neighborhood. We knew our neighbors, we cooked and cared for one another, and the many, many kids played outside on quiet streets into the evenings. In my neighborhood, I witnessed the compassion and the collaboration that people are capable of. We were part of each other's lives in meaningful ways. I was lucky to know from an early age the joy of neighbors. And I've known the work of neighbors too. It wasn't all picket fences and people delivering pies, but our lives were better for having one another nearby. So while I, raised in the church and theologically trained at 2 seminaries, have sometimes struggled intellectually with the first commandment to love God, I've always found the second commandment to love your neighbor very clear. Not always easy, but theologically straightforward. Now, in our day-to-day lives, we think of our neighbors in terms of proximity and geography. But I'm going to go ahead and suggest that the second commandment isn't saying, love the person whose property line comes up against your own, which naturally leads to the question, who is our neighbor? So the Good Samaritan story that you heard is the one that I go back to. And the Good Samaritan story is very specific in answering the question of who our neighbor is. And it has nothing to do with proximity or geography. Jesus challenges his followers to recognize all people, even those we despise or fear, even those least prestigious, even those least like us, as our neighbors. It's a simple teaching, but it's a helpful reminder because the more prominent structures and stories that we live within, including our geographically bound neighborhoods, suggest otherwise. They suggest that our neighbors are those who live near us. But our neighborhoods frequently function to separate people, historically by race and by class, and more recently, functionally, by wealth. This is our story in Vancouver, too. In fact, Vancouver's earliest city planning was heavily influenced by a fellow named Harland Bartholomew. Local housing expert Stephanie Allen has researched and written articulately about Bartholomew and his effort to see continued racial segregation in cities. Here's a bit of what I've learned from Stephanie. So it used to be, this is like the little bit of nerdy city stuff. It used to be that zoning ordinances, which are the rules that outline what can be built where, could explicitly say, this is a white neighborhood and black residents aren't allowed. In 1916, the US Supreme Court struck those ordinances down. Harland Bartholomew, who was one of the earliest professional city planners in the US, figured out a kind of a workaround. He started zoning what he called first residential neighborhood status to existing white majority neighborhoods, allowing only high-end single-family homes, sometimes with light stores and commercial around the outskirts, and then second residential status to black majority neighborhoods, allowing dense multifamily housing, commercial, and often heavier polluting industrial uses. Restrictive zoning was a proxy for other types of exclusion. And while racial segregation like this was more explicit in large US cities, This pattern of land use is the same here. We have apartments and multifamily housing clumped together closer to industrial lands or lining major arterials, and then swaths of quiet, car-dependent neighborhoods of single, detached homes. That's the city that I grew up in, and as a city councilor who makes current zoning decisions, this history is always in my mind. We've been accustomed to thinking of our neighbors as those who live near us. But in many places, those who live near us, because of some mix of intentional and unintentional policy decisions, tend to be relatively similar to us. I mean, maybe they have an annoying dog or a large tree that blocks the light, or they park in the space in front of our house and it drives us totally bananas. They aren't exactly like us, but most of our large cities are, because of some combination of intention and consequence, similarly segregated. And of course, our whole city here has been built on the unceded land of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations, and yet they too were segregated to specific plots of land. And also, our history of protecting low-density neighborhoods from mixed housing has led to a reliance on private vehicles and massive urban sprawl, which is why I care so much about housing policy, not just as a justice issue, but also as a climate issue. Our infatuation with this dream of a large house with a large private yard and an abundance of space to fill with belongings has led to long commutes, loss of vital farmland, unending consumerism, and huge environmental footprints. So that's why when I'm faced with zoning questions, I'm thinking about what the climate emergency means with respect to complete communities that welcome all income levels, and thinking, actually, that we might need to be a little bit more Sesame Street and a little bit less Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. The thing is, I like having neighbors. I like being a neighbor, and I want, like most of us, I think, to be a good neighbor, even to those quite unlike me. And I want my kids to grow up around people who are different than them. Our sense of the world is shaped by what we see of it, and I want them to embrace and not fear difference. In her most recent book, Braving the Wilderness, author and researcher Brené Brown writes, "People are hard to hate close up. Move in." People are hard to hate close up. Fred Rogers provided a good example of that. Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood began airing in 1968, following an intense decade of political assassinations, the civil rights movement, and the Vietnam War. Mr. Rogers showed a world of kindness where neighbors love and support each other through all sorts of challenges. But he didn't coddle them. He helped his audience, young and old, face their own fears and prejudices. And of all his 865 episodes, one in particular still stands out. One of the frequent visiting characters in the neighborhood was Francois Clemens, a talented opera singer and the descendant of slaves who played a police officer on the show. In 1989, a year after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, at a time when Black Americans were still prevented from swimming alongside whites in pools across the country, the neighborhood featured an episode where Mr. Rogers, who was white, invited Officer Clemens, who was Black, to join him in soaking his bare feet in a backyard baby pool on a hot summer's day. And as they sat there next to each other, the camera paused with intention on Rogers' very white feet, soaking right next to Clemens' very black feet. Many Americans at the time rarely interacted with those of another race. Their neighborhoods were still functionally segregated, and Mr. Rogers demonstrated how his viewers' lives could be richer if they saw one another up close. as neighbors. And theologian that he was, he did so with imagery that connected his audience to the Christian ritual of foot washing, of serving another as an act of connection and of faith. Mr. Rogers, the minister, was doing his bit in guiding a country fearful about desegregation. We too are living in fearful times. We face our own enormous set of challenges, emboldened hatred and growing division, a widening wealth gap, and a world on fire. The stakes are high, and everywhere we see people reverting to their own safe corner. Our neighborhoods were designed to keep us apart, but now, as much as ever, we desperately need to see one another up close, to bear witness to the difficulty others face, and to be broken open to one another's humanity. We are capable of it. In fact, I would argue we are hardwired for it. My partner Seth is writing a book about the climate emergency and sent me a quote from author Rebecca Solnit, who has detailed how consistently expressions of human caring and solidarity arise during crisis. Solnit writes, "In the wake of an earthquake, a bombing, or a major storm, most people are altruistic, urgently engaged in caring for themselves and those around them, strangers and neighbors, as well as friends and loved ones. The image of the selfish, panicky human being in times of disaster has little truth to it. Decades of meticulous sociological research on behavior in disasters, from the bombings of World War II to floods, tornadoes, earthquakes, and storms across the continent and around the world, have demonstrated this. Horrible in itself," Solnit continues, "disaster is sometimes the back door into paradise, the paradise at least in which we are who we hope to be, do the work we desire, and are our sisters and brothers' keeper." So what does that mean for us in this moment? Most of us are, for now, slightly shielded from the most devastating impacts of the housing crisis and the climate emergency, but we are informed enough to know that for a great many of our neighbors in this city and around the globe, largely poor and racialized folks, the human toll is already being felt. And we likely recognize that it's only going to intensify. According to the UN, between 2 million and 1 billion migrants will be on the move because of climate change by 2050, around the globe and in our neighboring municipalities. Where will these people live? In his famous Riverside sermon, A Time to Break Silence, Dr. Martin Luther King preached that on the one hand, we are called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside, but that will only be the initial act. One day, we must come to see that the whole Jericho Road must be transformed. How will we respond to emboldened racism and xenophobia, to the instability of housing more and more people face, to climate change and climate migrants? Are we ready to dismantle the barriers that divide us, to see one another up close? This will be the test of who we are in the coming years and decades. Will we love our neighbors, particularly those very unlike us? Will we welcome them and make space for them, not just abstractly, but in tangible ways? At the end of the telling of the parable of the Good Samaritan, Jesus answers the question of who is my neighbor by saying, "He who showed mercy, love, kindness, and justice." Then Jesus said, "Go and do likewise." Amen.